I was a nurse, badge on my chest, white uniform, a child's drawing pinned to the fridge. Everything was by the book, everything under control. One day I just signed one extra prescription to help, to make it to payday. A year later, I woke up in a cell where my name was a number and my daughter was replaced by silence. And only then did I understand poverty isn't a crime, but the fear of it can become a sentence. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is Ashley Marlowe, and I was 32 when the ground beneath me began to crack, though I didn't feel it right away. Back then, I still believed in routines, in alarm clocks, in rinsing coffee mugs before work. I worked as a nurse at a small community clinic on the outskirts of Knoxville, Tennessee, where patients walked in with more worries than insurance, and where we treated fevers and fractures with the same weary kindness. I lived in a modest trailer parked at the edge of a forgotten road, just past a rusted mailbox with peeling numbers and a porch light that flickered like a pulse unsure of itself. Life had its patterns. I'd wake up at 5:30 sharp, pack my daughter Lila's lunch, always a sandwich cut diagonally, never across, check her backpack for notes from school, brush her curls with the gentleness of a woman who's learned how easily children bruise. She was 6, bright-eyed, all questions and band-aids and stories about the moon. She asked me once if the moon ever got lonely. I told her no, but I wasn't so sure. I kept our life stitched together like a patchwork quilt, each corner tugging in a different direction. The clinic was understaffed, the hours were long, and my feet never stopped aching by the time I peeled off my scrubs at night. But I took pride in my work. I liked the quiet authority of my badge, the way patients looked at me as if I held answers. I didn't, not really, but I knew how to speak gently and how to make a frightened child smile while stitching up a gash. That felt like something. Bills came in stacks: rent, car repairs, groceries, Lila's asthma meds. They never stopped, like waves breaking on a shore too tired to resist. I juggled them like a circus act, robbing one envelope to feed another. I made payment plans, begged for extensions, cooked with what was left in the pantry. Canned beans and rice, instant oatmeal stretched thin. I told myself it was temporary, just a hard season, just until I caught up. But the gap kept widening. Overtime hours were cut. The state funding for the clinic was drying up. They asked us to bring our own gloves sometimes, told us to reuse face shields. Patients waited longer. Staff grew thinner. The coffee in the break room became a luxury we whispered about. Some nights I'd lie awake, listening to the sound of the refrigerator hum in the dark, wondering how long it would take before everything caved in. I'd stare at the ceiling and think of Lila asleep in the next room, her little chest rising and falling in the dim light of her night lamp. I would count her breaths like prayers. I would imagine a future where she had more, not just more toys or new shoes, but stability, a warm bed that didn't shake when the wind blew too hard, a home with rooms that didn't leak when it rained. I wanted to be the mother who gave her those things, not the one who made her small world feel like it could disappear overnight. Still, I smiled through the mornings. I packed her lunch, tied her shoes, and walked her to the school bus with my coffee in hand and my hair tied back. I joked with the bus driver. I waved as the bus turned the corner. I drove to the clinic with music playing low, trying to believe that everything was manageable, that all of this was just part of the climb. I didn't talk about the notices taped to the front door. I didn't mention the food pantry I visited every third Wednesday, or the fact that I sometimes skipped meals so Lila could have more. I didn't say out loud that the rent was 3 weeks late again. I didn't want to sound like I was failing. I had worked too hard to hold on this long. People think desperation is loud, that it kicks down doors or leaves bruises you can see. But the truth is, it's quiet. It creeps in through cracks. It waits patiently while you tell yourself you're okay. It lets you believe in tomorrow while it poisons today. I felt it settle in my chest like a second set of lungs, shallow and cold. And still, I carried on. I was the nurse with the steady hands, the mother who made do, the woman who smiled at neighbors and brought casseroles to community potlucks. I wore normalcy like armor, convincing everyone, including myself, that I was fine. But things don't break all at once. They split slowly, along lines you can't see until it's too late, and mine had already begun. It didn't start with a plan. There was no dramatic moment, no thunderstorm overhead, no whisper in my ear telling me to cross a line. It started with fatigue, with a long shift, with a form left unsigned on the counter, with a voice in my head saying, "No one will notice." That day had bled into itself like so many others. The clinic was short-staffed again. Mrs. Kersey had fallen in the waiting room. A baby spiked a fever that wouldn't go down. One of the nurses called in sick, and I floated between exam rooms, grabbing vitals, updating charts, cleaning up a child's vomit from the tile floor. I hadn't eaten lunch. I hadn't peed in 6 hours. I could feel my heart beating in my calves from standing too long. The prescription pad sat on the desk, half filled out by Dr. Sanders before he'd rushed off to his own emergency. It was for a patient I recognized, a woman I'd seen curled up in pain more times than I could count, always clutching her side, her skin pale and clammy. She had chronic pancreatitis, and the painkillers she needed were carefully controlled, sparingly distributed, always questioned. She was crying in the hallway, her coat too big for her bones, her eyes ringed with the kind of sleeplessness that no tea or meditation app could fix. I'd seen her like that before, and I'd seen how she unraveled when we told her there was nothing we could do until the doctor returned. I knew what she needed. I knew what would help. The line on the form waited, blank and expectant, like a question that already knew its answer. So I signed it. My hand didn't even tremble. I didn't feel wicked or sneaky or brave. I felt practical, efficient. The patient took her script. She mouthed thank you, her lips shaking with relief. She didn't know I wasn't supposed to sign it, and no one asked. When I got home that night, I stood in the shower longer than usual, watching the water circle the drain like it was trying to carry something away. I felt light, like I'd done a good thing, or at least not a bad one. Maybe that was the danger. A week later, it happened again. This time, it wasn't a crying woman in pain. It was a man I barely knew, an old friend of a friend, who had heard I worked at the clinic. He showed up in the parking lot after my shift. He smiled. He talked fast. He said his mother had been denied a refill for her anxiety meds and was starting to go off the rails. He handed me a piece of paper, already filled out, just missing a signature. He said, "It's just one time." He said, "I'll owe you." I said no. Then he held out an envelope, said there was $200 in it, said it could be more next time. I didn't take the money. I didn't throw it away either. The envelope sat on my passenger seat all the way home. I thought about the rent. I thought about the overdue utility notice I'd stuffed behind the microwave. I thought about the way Lila's shoes squeaked because the soles were worn too thin. When I finally opened the envelope, the money looked like any other money. It didn't shimmer or burn. It didn't carry a warning. It just lay there, plain and green and enough. The signature came easily the next morning. I told myself it was for someone's mother, that I was helping, that I was smoothing the cracks in a broken system, that I was still a nurse, still a good person. The lines I crossed after that became harder to see. The first few times, I told myself it was exceptional, that there was a reason, a justification. Then it became a habit, a rhythm. Certain names were passed to me through whispers and texts. I didn't ask too many questions. They didn't ask for my face, only my pen. The prescriptions became numbers on a screen. The names were always ordinary, the dosages always small enough not to trigger suspicion. I learned how to stagger them, how to mimic patterns of legitimate patients. I used clinic templates, changed a few details, created a trail that didn't look like a trail. Every time I hit send, my hands stayed steady. The money started coming in regular waves. It didn't make me rich, but it made me breathe easier. I bought Lila a new jacket that actually fit. I filled the fridge without needing coupons. I paid down the credit card that had hovered like a guillotine above my head for months. I told myself I was surviving, that the world had no safety net for people like me, that the system was flawed and I was simply adjusting the scales. But the truth was quieter and crueler. I had stopped believing I would ever get ahead the right way. Each day, I showed up to work in my scrubs, with my badge clipped neatly to my collar and my smile ready. I chatted with patients, held trembling hands, whispered encouragement to new mothers, adjusted IVs, and kept the rhythm of a life that looked normal from the outside. No one suspected the wear and tear underneath, the soft collapse of something once firm inside me. And yet, deep down, I knew. There was a moment every time I passed a mirror where my eyes refused to meet themselves. A flicker of avoidance, a flash of something I couldn't name. Maybe it was shame. Maybe it was fear of being found out. Maybe it was the beginning of mourning for who I had once been before the lines blurred. I didn't stop, even when I started hearing about overdoses in neighboring counties, even when a patient came in shaking, sweating, begging for more than what was prescribed, even when my own daughter found one of the envelopes in the bottom of my purse and asked if we were rich now. I laughed it off. I told her it was a gift, but it wasn't. It was the weight I had chosen to carry, the price I had accepted for temporary relief. A quiet deal made in desperation, written not in ink but in silence. The step had been small, but the fall had already begun. They came for me before sunrise. The knock on the door was not a knock at all, but a pounding, a blunt rhythm that rattled the thin walls of my rented house. For a moment I thought I was still dreaming. The sound folded into the last fragments of sleep like a warning. By the time I opened my eyes, there were red and blue lights flashing through the blinds, splintering the dimness of my living room into jagged stripes. My hands went cold before I even reached the door. I knew, without knowing, that everything had ended. The metal of the handcuffs bit into my wrists with an intimacy I wasn't prepared for. It was not like in the movies, no dramatic declaration of rights echoing with importance, just a rough hand guiding me down the steps, the flash of cameras from somewhere across the street, a neighbor's curtain moving as she tried to see. My feet were bare because I hadn't had time to put on shoes. I felt every pebble in the driveway, sharp as accusation. The morning air smelled like rain and gasoline, and somewhere a dog barked as if it were echoing my heart. The patrol car was colder than it should have been. The vinyl seat stuck to the back of my thighs. My hands rested on my lap, palms up, wrists locked together like some grim prayer. Through the window, the town passed by in fragments. Storefronts still shuttered, gas stations glowing under harsh lights. The same streets I'd driven 100 times to take my daughter to school. Everything familiar and unreachable. My reflection in the glass didn't look like me. It looked like a woman who had been peeled out of her life and left hollow. Processing at the jail was a blur of fluorescent light, and commands barked too fast to follow. Shoes off, belt off, hands here, face there. The camera's flash went off before I could adjust my expression. The photograph would follow me for years, the frozen image of my humiliation. The fingerprint ink was sticky and smelled like something chemical and cheap. Each finger pressed down, rolled, lifted. My identity reduced to black swirls on a card. When they handed me the uniform, I held it like it might burn. It was stiff, a color somewhere between orange and rust, rough against my skin. My clothes disappeared into a plastic bag, sealed and labeled, like evidence. I stood under the harsh light while a female officer patted me down, her latex gloves snapping. There was no malice in her movements, only procedure, but I felt stripped of something I hadn't realized was mine until it was gone. Dignity, privacy, personhood. The cell door closed with a sound I can still hear in my bones. Not a slam, but a heavy mechanical thunk, final and impersonal, like a machine swallowing a coin. Inside, the air was stale and cool. The walls were a sickly shade of off-white, streaked with marks where other hands had idly scraped. The cot was a thin mattress over metal, the blanket rough and gray, fraying at the edges. A stainless steel toilet squatted in the corner without so much as a partition. There was no place to hide, not even from myself. I sat on the edge of the cot and tried to breathe. The room smelled of disinfectant and something human beneath it. Sweat, despair, old tears. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, a constant low hum that drilled into my skull. Time did not move the same way there. Minutes stretched and twisted, folding back on themselves until hours felt like days. The silence was not truly silence, but a mosaic of small noises. Footsteps echoing down the hall, the distant clang of another door, muffled voices rising and falling, a cough that never seemed to stop. Yet under it all there was a stillness so deep it felt like falling into a well. I tried to remember the world outside, my daughter's face, the smell of coffee in the clinic break room, the sound of my car starting in the cold. Each memory flickered like an old film, edges curling, images warped. They belonged to someone else now, a woman who had vanished into paperwork and steel. Night in the cell was another kind of darkness. The lights never fully went out, but they dimmed to a dull glow, just enough to keep shadows at bay. I lay on my back, staring at the ceiling, counting cracks as if they were stars. The blanket scratched at my skin. The mattress sagged in the middle. My body ached with exhaustion, but my mind raced. I replayed every decision, every signature, every envelope. My mistakes lined up like a procession, silent and condemning. I realized then how much of my life had been noise, phones ringing, patients calling, laughter from the next room, my daughter's small voice asking for help with her shoes, all of it gone. In its place was this sterile stillness, the echo of my own heartbeat against concrete walls. I had thought being arrested would feel like chaos, like being dragged into a storm, but it was the opposite. It was an erasure, a stripping away. The storm had already passed, and this was the hollowed out calm left behind. At some point in the night, I began to shiver. The metal frame of the cot radiated cold through the thin mattress. My hands sought each other for warmth, fingers laced like a child's prayer. My wrists still bore faint red marks from the cuffs. I stared at them until my vision blurred. They looked like bracelets, like rings of shadow, like the first faint outlines of a cage drawn on my skin. I wondered if anyone thought of me at that moment. My daughter asleep in a stranger's house, the neighbors sipping coffee, already telling the story of my fall, the patients who would find a new nurse, forget my name. The world kept turning, and I sat on a thin mattress in a box of cinder block and metal, shivering at the enormity of it. In the silence of that first night, I understood something I had never let myself feel before. I was no longer part of the world I had known. I was a number, a file, a body behind a door. And inside me, there was a hollow place growing, colder than the cot, heavier than the door, a silence that belonged to no one but me. It didn't happen all at once. The transformation from woman to number was gradual, like a slow erosion. No one came and told me, "You're no longer who you were." They didn't need to. The system did it for them, with its forms and uniforms, its rules and routines, until even I began to forget the sound of my own name said with kindness. They called me Inmate 4762. They said it without malice, just efficiency, like reading off a menu. Names carried stories, numbers carried order. I learned to answer to it like it was mine, not with pride, but with the kind of resignation that settles in your bones when you realize no one is coming to call you anything else. The prison itself was a gray landscape of repetition, rows of concrete, endless gates, locked doors that buzzed open only to close again behind you. Time was chopped into rigid segments. Wake up, count, meal, work, count, meal, work, count, sleep. The days were blocks of ice you chipped away at with the blunt edge of survival. You didn't try to reshape them. You just tried not to get crushed. Mornings started early, always too early. The light snapped on with a fluorescent glare that burned the darkness from your eyelids whether you were ready or not. The air was never warm, even in summer. There was a chill in that place, not just physical but embedded in the walls. I'd wake to the sound of feet shuffling, toilets flushing, voices muttering into nothing. Women moved through the corridors like ghosts in uniform, eyes forward, mouths closed. I worked in the laundry room. It smelled like bleach and damp cotton, and the machines roared so loudly that thoughts couldn't form unless you screamed them in your head. We washed the same uniforms we wore, pressed them, folded them, passed them on to the next round of invisible bodies. The fabric was stiff and colorless, but we handled it like it mattered, because when you had nothing, even routine became a tether. There were moments, small ones, when I caught pieces of myself reflected in another. The curve of a shoulder, the way someone sat with their hands folded just like I used to. But those glimpses faded fast. We all learned not to look too long. Staring invited challenge. Speaking too much brought trouble. Silence was safer. Eye contact was a risk. The guards didn't see us. Not really. They saw movement, compliance, resistance, disruption. We were data points on a clipboard, problems to manage. Some of them were cruel in subtle ways. never raising their voice, but always twisting the knife with a word or a smirk. Others were indifferent, floating above us like ceiling tiles, unreachable and uninterested. A few were kind, but kindness was rationed even tighter than food. The food itself was beige, always beige. Slabs of something called meat, mashed starches, overcooked vegetables that sagged on the tray. We ate because hunger didn't care about flavor. Meals were quiet, interrupted only by the occasional shout, the scrape of plastic trays, the sudden bang of a fist when someone lost the thread of control. There were women in there who'd been inside for decades. You could see it in the way they moved, slow, deliberate, without expectation. They had prison in their posture. They told stories in the laundry room about the world before cell phones, before the internet, before everything. I listened like a child listens to bedtime tales, hungry for anything that reminded me there was still a world out there. I kept to myself. I wasn't trying to prove anything. I wasn't tough, and I didn't want to be. I followed the rules. I learned the unspoken ones, too. Don't ask questions. Don't offer help unless asked. Don't borrow. Don't owe. I learned to walk with purpose, to speak only when necessary, to make myself small and unthreatening. Letters from the outside came less and less. At first, I would sit on my bunk and wait for mail call with a lump in my throat, hoping for the curve of a familiar handwriting, a drawing, a message from my daughter. But most days, there was nothing. And after a while, I stopped waiting. The absence became its own presence. You start to measure time in what doesn't arrive. Birthdays pass. Holidays blur together. The seasons exist only in the stories of new arrivals. Snow, rain, heat waves. They meant nothing behind these walls. We all lived under the same artificial light, the same forced air, the same indifferent sky. I missed touch the most. Not sex, not affection, just the ordinary comfort of being held, of someone brushing past you without tension. In prison, every touch had weight. A hand on your shoulder could mean friendship or a warning. A glance could start a war. I missed brushing Lila's hair, the way her little fingers curled around mine when she was tired. I would lie awake and remember the weight of her on my hip, the soft press of her head against my chest. Memory became both comfort and torment. At night, I would sometimes whisper my own name under my breath, just to remember how it sounded. Ashley, not inmate, not 47612, just Ashley. I said it like a secret, like a thread I could follow back to the person I used to be. But that thread grew thinner each day. You learn to live as a number. You stop asking why. You stop believing that life owes you anything more than this. The shame doesn't come in loud moments. It comes in the quiet ones, when you realize how much you've adapted, when you catch yourself defending the rules, scolding someone for stepping out of line, just to maintain the fragile illusion of order. I wasn't the only one disappearing. I saw it in the eyes of the women around me. Some hardened, some broke, some just faded. We were women once, mothers, daughters, workers, dreamers. But in here, we were just units in a system that fed on compliance. No one came to ask us who we used to be. No one wanted to know. And after a while, neither did we. I didn't have an epiphany. No light cracked through the cinder block ceiling. No sudden voice inside me whispered a better way. It wasn't like that. Change in prison didn't arrive as a miracle. It arrived in fragments, tiny, stubborn pieces that cut you as you picked them up. Shards of regret, slivers of guilt, little glimmers of something not yet dead inside you. It came slowly, and it came after I thought I had nothing left worth saving. It started with a book. Someone had left it on the table in the common room. Its cover was torn, and the pages were dog-eared and stained, but I opened it anyway, just to pass the time. It was about trauma and addiction, written in plain language. It didn't try to sell anything or save me. It just described people who were hurting and how their pain had found ways to speak through their worst choices. For the first time in a long time, I saw myself in something. Not the parts that committed the crime, but the parts underneath, the fatigue, the fear, the hunger for control. I read the book 3 times. I copied down paragraphs in the back of my commissary receipts. I wrote in the margins like the pages could hear me. The prison had a small library, barely a closet with metal shelves. But I began to spend hours there, buried in books that made my world feel wider than concrete. Psychology, philosophy, even poetry. Anything that pulled me back to thought, to reflection. I began to write at night, scribbling with a broken pencil on scraps of paper. I wrote letters I'd never send. I wrote lists of what I'd done wrong, and under them, lists of what I still wanted to do right. Then came the group therapy sessions. At first, I hated them. Sitting in a circle of women I barely knew, forced to speak, to be vulnerable, felt like peeling skin from old wounds. But slowly, as weeks passed, I began to understand the power of being seen. One woman spoke about the child she'd lost to the foster system. Another talked about the first time she stole, just to feel like she had power. Their voices didn't seek pity. They sought truth, raw, imperfect, painful truth. I remember the first time I spoke about my daughter in front of them. My voice cracked halfway through. I couldn't finish, but one woman reached over and passed me a tissue. That simple gesture, a hand extended without judgment, was more mercy than I thought I deserved. That day, something shifted. The silence I'd built around my guilt began to break. There was a volunteer program, small and always understaffed, that offered courses in basic counseling and peer mentorship. I signed up, mostly to keep my mind busy, but soon it became something more. I learned how to listen, not just with my ears, but with patience, with intention. I learned how to recognize patterns, how to name what people often kept buried. I began mentoring women who were new to the facility. I helped them navigate the routines, the unspoken rules, the overwhelming sense of dislocation. I didn't offer advice. I offered presence. I sat with them in silence when they cried. I wrote their questions when they couldn't speak. I remembered what it felt like to arrive here and feel like the world had ended. Every time I helped someone find their footing, even in the smallest way, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in years. Dignity. Not pride, not redemption, but the quiet dignity that comes from usefulness, from purpose. I received a letter one afternoon, unexpected, thin, folded in half like a secret. It was from a social worker. She wrote to inform me that Lila had asked a question about me during a school project. Just one question. Was my mom always bad? The worker said she had responded with nuance, had explained that people were more than the worst thing they'd done. But it wasn't her words that haunted me. It was the question itself. Was I always bad? I didn't know how to answer that, but I started to try. I wrote letters to Lila. I never sent them. I didn't even know where she was living anymore. But I wrote about my memories, about the sound of her laughter, about the way she used to sleep with her feet tucked under my ribs. I wrote about my mistakes, not in the language of excuses, but in the language of someone finally willing to tell the truth. One night, after a session in the group room, I stayed behind and cleaned up the chairs. One of the guards, a woman who rarely spoke to me, paused on her way out. She looked at me and said, "You've changed." Just that. No praise, no smile, but something in her voice felt real. It undid me. I walked back to my bunk and sat there for a long time, holding those words like a fragile object in my hands. I'd changed. She saw it. I was not invisible. I was not just a number. That night, I pulled out every scrap of paper I had saved, all the notes, the journal pages, the quotes I had copied. I spread them out on my bunk like puzzle pieces. They didn't fit together yet. They didn't make a clean narrative, but they were mine, proof that something inside me had survived, something I could build on. Some women got out and came back. Others never left, even after the gates opened. I didn't know what would happen when my turn came, but I began to imagine it, not the fantasy of a clean slate, just the possibility of trying, of starting again, even if it was small, even if it was broken. Hope wasn't a fire. It was a slow, stubborn ember, and for the first time, I guarded it like something precious. The day I was released was bright, sharp, and indifferent. The kind of morning where the sun stung your skin, no matter how long you'd prayed for it behind walls. I stood at the edge of the gate, holding a paper bag with everything the system said belonged to me. A worn pair of shoes, a folded sweater that no longer smelled like home, $17 in gate money, a photocopied sheet of paper listing places I could go, shelters, halfway houses, a number to call if I felt like disappearing. No one waited for me. I had known that for months. Hope, by then, had been trimmed into a manageable shape, small enough to hold without letting it crush me. I didn't look around. I didn't expect a car, a face, a sign. I just stepped onto the sidewalk and felt the world roar into me. Everything outside was too loud. The colors too saturated, the people too fast, their laughter too sharp. The smell of car exhaust mixed with blooming trees made my stomach churn. The weight of space itself was unbearable. No walls, no fixed limits, no concrete corners to define where I ended and everything else began. I had forgotten how to walk without being watched. I had forgotten how to hold my body without apology. The halfway house was a bus ride away, but I chose to walk part of the distance. I needed the time. I needed to move under the open sky and feel my legs carry me forward like they still knew how. With each step, I tried to match my breath to the rhythm of strangers, to disguise my unease inside the anonymity of motion. But it clung to me, years of silence, of obedience, of institutional routine. I crossed streets too carefully. I flinched when someone brushed past me. I apologized to a lamppost when I bumped into it. The house was a narrow building squeezed between a church and a boarded-up store. Inside, it smelled like bleach and hope, two things that never really mixed. They gave me a bed in a shared room, a lockbox for my things, a clipboard of rules. I nodded through the orientation, too exhausted to absorb the words. That night, I lay on a mattress softer than any I'd known in years, and still couldn't sleep. The softness was foreign, the darkness too deep. I missed the dull hum of prison lights, the sound of breathing in the bunks above and below. Here, the silence had no shape. It pressed in from all sides. I tried to build a life in fragments, a job scrubbing floors in a nursing home, low pay, long hours, but no questions asked. I took it without hesitation, My hands remembered the rhythm of mops and buckets, of rubber gloves and bleach. I moved through the halls like a shadow, invisible but useful. I smiled at patients who looked right through me. I greeted staff who never asked my name. Sometimes I saw nurses in the halls, young women with badges clipped to their scrubs, chatting casually, checking charts. I avoided their eyes, not from shame, but from the dull ache of remembering who I used to be. My own badge had been taken, along with everything it meant. And yet, in the quiet hours, wiping down the stainless steel counters or replacing toilet paper rolls, I found a strange kind of peace. There was no performance here, just work, just breath, just the slow rebuilding of something lost. Reentry classes told us to manage expectations. Don't expect forgiveness. Don't expect your old life. Don't expect people to understand. They were right. Most people didn't look at me twice, and the ones who did looked away. I learned to live within that space, neither accepted nor hunted, just tolerated, like a weed growing through sidewalk cracks. I sent a letter to my daughter through the social worker. I wrote it 12 times before I found words that didn't sound like begging. I told her I was out, that I was trying, that I didn't expect anything. I just wanted her to know. Weeks passed, then months. I heard nothing. I told myself that was okay, that she had her own life now, that maybe the kindest thing I could do was stay quiet. But I still wrote. I wrote every week, letters folded into careful thirds, stored in a shoebox beneath my bed. I told her about the seasons, about the way fall smelled like rain and clean laundry. I told her about the old woman at the home who called me Angel without knowing why. I told her about the nightmares, about the way I sometimes woke with my hands clenched into fists, afraid to open my eyes. I never lied. I didn't say I was healed. I said I was trying to live honestly. That was the only promise I could make. One morning, I woke before the alarm and sat on the back steps of the house, watching the sky shift from blue to gold. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that used to scare me. But this time, it felt different. It didn't feel empty. It felt earned. I wrapped my arms around my knees and closed my eyes. Freedom, I realized, wasn't the street. It wasn't the job. It wasn't the absence of bars or the presence of choice. It was the silence inside me, the one that no longer howled with shame or begged for erasure. It was the breath I could take without holding it, the space between thoughts, uncluttered by fear, the moment I could look at my reflection, not to admire it, but to recognize it. I was not whole. I would never be who I once was, but I was no longer only what I had done. In that silence, I found room enough to begin.